So, how do you keep a society together? Sorry, the video cut off on me in the middle of my explanation. So, consider this part two. Um, well, there's actually several things that end up keeping a society together, and they don't have to be governmental. They don't have to be in terms of a sovereign state of some sort. Um, they can be cultural, normative. They can be moral. There's many ways that a society that people still bond together that are completely outside of established institutions. And so there are several ways, and these are common things within your textbook that are referenced. So you should have an inkling of what these are. Weber called it social integration. It would be the different institutions like sports, mass media, things that pull people together, give them a sense of commonality. That's social integration. Then you have Durkheim. He ended up seeing two different types of solidarity: mechanical solidarity and organic solidarity. Mechanical solidarity is pre modern solidarity, organic solidarity is modern solidarity. And this largely hinges on the division of labor. And so, the more complex the division of labor, the more complex the society, the more diversity you end up seeing. Now, this is an important point to understand. um, it is the division of labor more than anything else in a modern society that injects diversity and difference and conflict into a society, not more so than anything else. All right. So in mechanical solidarity, it's solidarity by similarity. People end up believing the same things. They're dominated by tradition. They're doing the same things in terms of, surviving, making food, farming, animal husbandry that the parents did and their grandparents did and their great grandparents did. And there's not a lot of change from one generation to the next. Organic solidarity, we end up having such a highly complex division of labor that we're mutually dependent on one another. And so, there are a few people who can do this, but most of us living in organic society can't. Like, I couldn't pick up, go move out into the woods somewhere where there are no other people and actually survive. I would probably die because of exposure to the elements or drinking water that wasn't properly purified or starvation or any illness, any number of different things. And people living in a mechanical society or under mechanical solidarity would know how to do all of those things. In organic solidarity, we've broken up that knowledge of survival into different institutions, different sectors of the economy, and different groups. And so the knowledge still exists within society, but your average individual within organic society doesn't have it. It doesn't have all of it. And so we have to stay in society under organic solidarity because we have no other choice. We don't know how, most of us don't know how to farm. Most of us don't know how to build a house. Most of us don't know how to purify water if we don't already have the equipment with us to do so. Um, and simply boiling can only do so much. All right. Then we have some other concepts that are getting at similar kinds of things in sociology, coming from Ferdinand Tönnies. Now, Tony's is famous for his concepts of Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. Gemeinschaft is German for community, Gesellschaft is German for society. Now, obviously, since we keep them in the German, we mean more by that than just community and society. So community would sync up with pre-modern societies. It would be what Durkheim would call mechanical solidarity. But Tony's had a different evaluation of this. He saw Gemeinschaft as being a place where there's a strong sense of community, a strong social bond. People care about each other. There's an emotional bond. He saw it as more human, actually. Whereas Gesellschaft, which would correspond with modern organic society, is more about economic rationalism and seeing what you can get out of a person or how you can get ahead of a person or It fosters self-interest over social interest and collective interest. And so he sees Gesellschaft as mainly being stuck together because of individual interests, and he sees that as being a weak kind of way of bonding as a society that leaves that society open to all kinds of different attacks from the outside and corruption and decay from the inside. Now, these are all things in terms of social structure. What about social interaction? What about the content? How people are actually interacting with one another on the daily? Well, a lot of this ends up coming out of symbolic interactionism. Again, keep in mind, symbolic interactionism is the major micro level theory. So the first one would be stereotypes. And stereotypes are mental shortcuts that people use. They could be something as simple as, well, I like Tex-Mex food. Well, does that mean that you're going to like every restaurant that calls itself Tex-Mex? No. But you're going to be more likely to try a restaurant that calls itself Tex-Mex if that's something you really like, right? So even though the restaurant might be a kind of Tex-Mex you don't like, you're going to be more likely to try it than a new, say, sushi place if you have a different way of thinking about sushi. So what does that mean? Is that bad? Is No, that's not bad. There's nothing wrong with it whatsoever. It's that you have different preferences and then you develop stereotypes, and those stereotypes act as mental shortcuts so that you don't have to give a lot of thought to every little decision you make. The problem with stereotypes when you apply them to groups of people and you think that groups of people are all the same and you don't see the person within the group. And also, stereotypes are not cultural patterns. In sociology, we study cultural patterns, and those are empirical patterns that exist within a group of people. Stereotypes are based on people's belief about a group of people without empirical study. All right. So, while stereotypes are an important part of social interaction, it's also important to work against stereotyping other people. All right. Second part of social interaction is personal space. Now, personal space depends on the culture you're in. In the United States, we have a much bigger social bubble on average than other cultures do. Other cultures, you're talking with someone that you barely know or you just met, and they can get right in your face talking. And, to an American, that can make you uncomfortable, but to them, that's just um, how they interact with people. That's their sense of social space. So, in the United States, we've got four different types of social space, and you can actually tell by how close people are standing to one another when they're interacting, how formal or informal the relationship is, or how close the people are. So, intimate distance, if you're standing within 18 inches of one another, this would be close relationships. This would be close friends, family members that you're close with, romantic partners, people like that. Personal distance can be 18 inches to 4 feet. These are friends and acquaintances. These are people that you like, you hang out with, but you're not as close as with the intimate distance. Then you have social distance, 4 to 12 feet. These are formal relationships. For instance, when we're all meeting in classrooms, formal relationship of professor and student. Students, when they walk up to talk with professors in America, rarely breach the 4 foot bubble and stand at least 4 feet away from the professor. Then we have the most formal relationships at public distance, which is 12 feet or more. And this will typically also include some kind of barrier or people standing to make sure that people stay 12 feet away. This could be things like, listening to a musician or a political rally or any number of things like that. All right. The next part, the social interaction, eye contact. Number three, eye contact is one of the ways we control our social space. Whether you make eye contact with someone that's trying to catch your eye or not, communicates a world to them. Number four is smiling. Now Americans, it's a little different. Like I had the experience when I went to Austria for the first time. It was 2006, and it was the first time I'd ever, actually traveled to Germanic culture. I was still a grad student at that point in time. And I realized in that trip just how American I am. And what I mean by that that we Americans, we smile all the time, regardless of how we're feeling, and regardless of whether or not we know the person. I mean, as you walk around, you might smile at someone, just nod at them. If you just accidentally catch their eye, just hello, I'm acknowledging a fellow human being. Well, in Germanic cultures, smiling is typically only reserved for people you know, and it's not just an empty gesture, but something that contains a lot of meaning. And so when I was walking around and I would catch people's eyes and I would just smile at them in Klagenfurt, people would stop and stare at me. And I asked a German scholar there what was going on, and they explained to me that they were trying to. I was violating norms by smiling at people who I didn't know, and that they were trying to figure out whether they knew me from somewhere, or they were trying to figure out if I was trying to hit on them or something. Um, and so, yeah, I quickly learned to stop smiling at people I didn't know. And then the fifth way of social interaction is just body language in general. And yes, eye contact and smiling are technically within body language. But body language by this we're meaning more general, like gestures, like how I talk with my hands, which is actually a bad habit, but one that I have nonetheless. Now, Irving Goffman. Irving Goffman is oftentimes categorized as a symbolic interactionist. Um, and while he was definitely influenced by symbolic interactionism, he kind of created his own perspective. And he was also very much influenced by later theories like post structuralism. Now, Goffman said that society in general could be looked at kind of like theater. And he created a perspective called dramaturgy. Dramaturgy is the way of comparing through analogy the ways we act and behave within society to the ways that actors behave and interact with one another on a stage. It's kind of a sociological restatement of that old line from Shakespeare. And I paraphrase because I can't remember it exactly, but all the world's a stage and we are all but actors in it. It's the same idea, basically, 500 years later. Um, Now, his methodology is typically referred to as dramaturgical analysis. And within this, let's break down how this works. So, we all play roles, right? And those roles come with certain expectations. Those expectations are like scripts. And those scripts will even come with props. So, for example, one of the roles that I play within our society is an educator, teacher, which is just one part of the broader role, professor, really. Educational duties are just one small part of all the overall what it is to be a professor. Um, Now, within that, especially right now, I need certain tools. Now, if I were teaching in a classroom, I would be using a dry erase marker or chalk. We need computers because most things now are online, and I need a camera, and I need all of these different props and tools, right? And if you're playing a different role, you need different props. Um, and so if you're a parent taking care of a child, and that's the role you're playing, then you're going to need depending on the age of the child, maybe a diaper bag, toys, things to keep the child entertained, snacks, all kinds of things. Those are what we call the social expectations of these various roles. Now, they work in many ways like a script, but we can all put our own spin on it. That's called role performance. That's where we all put our individual spin on it. So, you've all had at this point exposure to at least several different professors, and we all have different teaching styles and different types of self-presentation and things like that. But we all would fall typically within the parameters of Western educational models. In that sense, then, I'm falling within the parameters, but I'm putting my own spin on it, right? That's role performance. So we're not as strict. We can improv a little bit in society. We don't have to stick strictly to a script, like in classical theater. Now we see impression management, which is exactly what you've heard it means. It's people's effort to control other people's impression of them. And we do this all the time, though. It's not just trying to make a good impression when you're interviewing for a job or you're meeting a significant other's parent for the first time or something like that. We are constantly going through impression management, even with strangers. We're trying to control how they perceive us and make sure that they interpret us in the ways we want to be interpreted, and if they don't interpret us in ways we don't want to be interpreted. Now, Goffman breaks things down to front stage and backstage. Now, there can be multiple front stages and multiple back stages, and they can even cross over with one another. It's a question of, so front stage, generally defined, is the place where people give performances. So imagine a classroom, professor standing up in front of a chalkboard and lecturing to a class. Now, it might be easy to see the professor as the one who's on the front stage, but Goffman would say that the students are just as much on the front stage as the professor is, because while the professor is performing his or her role as educator, the students are performing his role as student. So, in this sense, everybody in that scenario is on the front stage because everyone's giving a performance of a particular role. Now, backstages are where you go where you feel like you can relax, where you can reflect on the performances that you've given. Oftentimes, they might have friends or family members in them that you can say, "Guess what happened to me today?" And you can tell them what happened, and then reflect on how you responded and ways you could have responded differently. And so, backstage is where you plan for future performances. All right. Now, when we're talking about roles, it's also important to keep in mind that because we play multiple roles and because there are different expectations within a single role, that we can experience what's known as role conflict and role strain. Role conflict are conflicts between roles. So, to use an example from your textbook, say that you are an employee, you are a student, a college student, and you are someone's best friend. Your professor schedules an exam for a particular day. Your friend, your best friend, is having a birthday party, and say they're turning 21. So, big birthday party, right? And it's the same day as the exam, or it's the day before the exam. And you have your employer calling you saying, "Everyone's called in sick, and we have no one working. You've got to come in. How important is your job to you? You have to come in and work." So right there, you got three roles. Which one? What are you going to do? You're going to study for the exam. You're going to go to your friend's birthday party. You're going to go to work. You can't do all three. And if you try to do all three, you're going to screw all three up. So, when people talk about what are your priorities, they're talking about which roles you consider most important to you. Do you consider the student role most important? Do you consider the friend role most important? Or do you consider the employee role most important? Role strain occurs within a role. So, the example that Henslin uses in your textbook would be the student, and say that you're a student and you want your professor to know that you're paying attention, you're doing the work, you're doing the readings, you're understanding the material. But at the same point in time, when you're giving your performance as student, you're not just playing for the professor, you're also playing for your peers in the classroom with you. And you don't want to come off as a know it all. So you end up experiencing role strain, where you might say, well, okay, well, I want the professor to know that I'm paying attention, so I'll answer some of the questions, but I won't answer all the questions because I don't want my fellow students to think I'm a know-it-all or I'm trying to show them up or something. So that would be an example of role strain that you're trying to balance two different sets of expectations. Now, Goffman actually refers to the props. So when I was talking about computers or chalkboards or things like that associated with the role of educator, he calls those props sign vehicles. That's his name, or his name for it. So it's a vehicle for communicating symbolic information about the role that you are playing in the moment. Teamwork is the collaboration of two or more people to jointly manage impressions. And so it's like friends who end up vouching for you, for instance, would be an example of that. Face saving behavior. Face saving behavior is another concept in dramaturgical analysis where people try to engage in behaviors to salvage an interaction that is going south. And so an example of it would be study non-observance. So say that, we were in a classroom setting and this wasn't a video and we were interacting face to face. And say that I had a booger just flapping, right? Every time I breathed, every time I took a breath. And you found it distracting from the material. And, you don't want to raise your hand and say, Dr. Harden, you've got a booger in your nose. You need to blow your nose. That might be considered rude, right? Or disrespectful. Actually, I would appreciate it personally, but all right. Or you might be afraid you might embarrass the professor. So what would be the face saving behavior you might engage in? Would be study non-observance, where you just look at your notes and you just listen to the lecture or you listen to the discussion, and you don't look at whatever it is that's distracting you from the interaction. Another concept from Goffman that's important here is civil inattention. Civil inattention is most often expressed now, today in America, with smartphones. So if somebody, you just look around in crowd when we used to have crowds of people, and you see everyone's just on their phone, right? And first thing that you might think to yourself if you weren't a part of the culture and didn't grow up with smartphones is how are they not bumping into each other or bumping into walls, and how do they know when to open doors, and how are they not tripping and falling? It's because the phone is a sign vehicle or a prop used to say, I don't want to interact with anyone right now. And they're still, though, they're pretending to be not paying attention to other people around them because they don't want to interact. But if they were truly not paying attention, they'd be bumping into walls and tripping and falling. And so people are very much paying attention to everything around them. They just don't want to interact. All right. So now it's important to understand that we internalize the roles that we play. They become a core part of who we are. And since a part of that would be careers and other things that change over the course of one's life, we all end up experiencing a kind of role exit. And role exits end up becoming like this identity crisis that people have because say that you've done the same thing, same job, or you've had the same career for the past 40 years, 50 years, and that's how you understand yourself and that's how you think of yourself, and then now you're retiring. Well, I mean, that's like a death of a part of the self, and you have to rethink how you understand yourself and how you understand yourself in relation to other people, because you've exited a major role that's defined your a big part of your life, and now you have to find other things to fill it with. Now, really important person for you to be aware of that I've mentioned before is Harold Garfinkel. Now, Garfinkel is a major figure because he lived 1917 to 2011, and he created the study, the theoretical perspective, the methodology of ethnomethodology, or the study of how people use background assumptions, or taken for granted assumptions about the world, to make sense out of life. And so it's basically a study of how people assume the world should be. Now, a related concept to background assumptions are indexical concepts. Indexical concepts could be things like core values. They could be illustrated simply by language. They defy clear definition. It's kind of like, you have to already know the definition in order to know the definition. So a concept of this, or an example of this, would be the word you, you, um, as in second person pronoun. Now, if you were to look up the word you in a dictionary, you would end up seeing something like second person pronoun referring to the other. That is not a definition of the word you. That is a description of its grammatical function. So, in this sense, then, indexical concepts are concepts that lack clear definition, but yet are the building blocks for how we understand the world around us. Now, this leads us to something I've discussed already, the social construction of reality. And the social construction of reality is the use of the background assumptions. Remember my analogy, or my example of if time travel were real and we could pull a 19th century industrialist and a 20th century hippie into the present and show them a forest. Would they see the same forest? No, they wouldn't. The industrialist would see raw materials to turn into commodities to sell into a market, and the 20th century hippie would end up seeing a shrine to nature to be preserved for all times, for future generation. Now, both of them are looking at the same forest, but both of them are constructing it based on their own values and their own interpretations. And so they're not seeing the same forest at all. They're seeing very different forests from one another. So it's not a question, social construction of reality is not a question of the objective existence of things within reality. Of course, things have an objective resistance as far as we can tell. Um, I'm not going to get into the limits of perception, but it's about our subjective beliefs and interpretations of those things. Now, a related concept to this is the Thomas theorem. The Thomas theorem was created by William I, or we just say WI oftentimes, and Dorothy S. Thomas's definition of the situation. If people define a situation as real, it doesn't matter if it's real or not. It's going to be real in its consequences. Classic example. Oftentimes the effects are exaggerated, but nonetheless, in the 1930s, you had the up and coming Orson Welles working as a radio disc jockey, DJ, and early in his career, right? He didn't really come into his own until the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s. But anyway, he decides one Halloween he's going to read H.G. Wells, the 19th century science fiction writer's novel, War of the Worlds, over the radio like it's a news broadcast. And he announced at the beginning of the broadcast it was for entertainment purposes only, but that was the only time he announced it. And so people were tuning in the middle of the broadcast, and they were hearing things like, "This just in. Martians have landed their flying saucers on the lawn of the White House and used their ray guns to kill the president and vice president, are moving on to the houses of Congress." And people freaked out. And many people ended up going into the woods, leaving the city, stockpiling supplies, guns, bullets, other weapons, getting ready to fight the Martian hordes coming to take over planet Earth. Now, did Martians, in point of fact, actually land and start taking over the planet Earth in the 1930s? No, of course not. But enough people believed it that it had a real social consequence. And so, even though it didn't in point of fact occur, it did occur in terms of its consequences. So, another example of the Thomas theorem, classic example, money. Money's not based anymore on anything physical, at least not in post-industrial economies. And so, like the American dollar, it's not based on gold, it's not based on silver, it's not based on anything material. It purely has value because people treat it as something with value. People believe it as to be something that is valuable, and they'll exchange goods and services for it, and therefore it does have value because we treat it as having value. That's called value by fiat. Value just because we say so. All right. Now, William Chambers, he did a study starting back in the 70s. It actually followed a group of kids for quite a while. That became a major part of a theoretical perspective known as labeling theory. And he called it the Saints and the Roughnecks. Now, this is something we're going to pick back up on in chapter 6 on deviance. But it's important here to at least know that the Saints and the Roughnecks, they were two groups of boys. They were both European American groups, both growing up in the same small town, both attending the same high school. So Chambers was controlling for all the possible variables. They were all the same racial background, ethnic background, they were all the same gender. The only difference between the boys was that the Saints were middle class and the Roughnecks were working class. And what he found was that the teachers ended up passing the Saints along, and the Roughnecks were thought of as problem kids, and so they were labeled. And then the Roughnecks started thinking of themselves as the problem kids, and the Saints thought of themselves as kids who could do nothing wrong. And Chambers follows them into their adulthood and meets back up with them, and all of the Roughnecks, except for two who had intervening events that ended up changing the course or the patterns of their lives, had criminal records and been in and out of prison. The Saints all went on, except for one who had an intervening event that ended up changing the course of his life. All the others ended up going on to college and then to graduate school and became professors, doctors, lawyers. Um, and Chambers caught up with him and asked the former Saints, do you still engage in deviant acts? And one was a lawyer for the mob. One doctor said, "Oh yeah, I cheat on my taxes all the time." And they were still engaging in all this illegal behavior and deviant behavior. But the whole point of labeling theory is the way that the labels, once applied successfully to a person, become internalized, and then they end up establishing patterns within your life that are really hard to change unless somebody outside the pattern changes it for you. That's the intervening events. All right, so that pretty much gets us through chapter 4. So, remember that exam 2, which is coming up, is going to cover chapters 3 and 4. You have now all the material you should possibly need to succeed on that exam. And I will see you all in the next video. Be well, stay safe.